Have you ever had a rough day and thought it couldn't possibly get any worse? Well, medieval peasants would like a word with you. Back when kings ruled the land and dragons filled storybooks, regular folks lived lives so wild and challenging that they would make your worst day look like a luxury vacation. Imagine living in a time when about 90% of people didn't have the basic things we take for granted. No electricity, no running water, and definitely no takeout delivery when you're too tired to cook. It was just you, your family, and whatever you could manage to grow or trade for. These folks were probably tougher than any gym enthusiast you'll meet today. While we're busy counting steps on our fitness trackers, they were getting an all-natural full-body workout every single day, whether they wanted it or not. Trust me, there was no protein shake waiting for them after their workout. But despite having what we would consider a pretty rough life, medieval peasants weren't sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. They created their own fun, built tight-knit communities, and probably had better social lives than some of us modern folks who spend our evenings scrolling through social media. When's the last time your entire neighborhood got together for a feast? And no, ordering from the same delivery app doesn't count. Life wasn't easy, but these people were incredibly resourceful because they had to be. When you're living in a world without convenience stores or online shopping, you learn to make do with what you have. It was like an extreme survival mode. But instead of lasting a few days like on those TV shows, this was their entire life. Now that we've established how tough their existence was, let me tell you about their actual work. And boy, did they work. Their day kicked off before sunrise, which in winter wasn't too bad at around 7 a.m. But in summer, we're talking 4 a.m. wake-up calls. You thought your morning alarm was brutal? A medieval peasant's work schedule would make today's hardest jobs look like a vacation. They didn't just do one job. They had to be farmers, carpenters, shepherds, and blacksmiths all rolled into one. You know how we have that saying, jack of all trades. Well, these folks invented it because if they didn't know how to do something, they'd better learn fast or go hungry. The farming year was divided into specific tasks that had to be done at exactly the right time. Spring meant plowing, and we're not talking about sitting in an air-conditioned tractor. 2 oxen pulled a heavy wooden plow, while the peasant had to use all their strength to keep it straight and at the right depth. Fun fact, it took about 8 oxen to plow 1 acre of heavy soil in a day. If you lost an ox, you were in serious trouble, kind of like losing your car and your job all at once. Summer brought its own challenges. From sunrise to sunset, peasants would be out in the fields weeding, because one patch of weeds could ruin an entire crop. They didn't have fancy weed killers either, just their hands and maybe a simple tool. Every single weed had to be pulled out by hand. My back hurts just thinking about it. And let's not forget the constant battle with pests. No pesticides meant you had to get creative. Some peasants would actually hire children to run through the fields making noise to scare away birds. It was probably the medieval equivalent of a summer job, except instead of flipping burgers, you were running around yelling at crows. But medieval peasants actually invented many of the farming techniques we still use today. They figured out crop rotation way before scientists could explain why it worked. They'd plant wheat 1 year, then barley the next, then leave the field empty. A practice called fallow, to let it recover. It's like they were the original agricultural scientists, just without the lab coats and clipboards. Fall was harvest time, and this is when things got really intense. Every able-bodied person in the village would be out in the fields, racing against time and weather to bring in the crops. They used sickles to cut the grain, basically a curved blade that you had to swing just right, or you'd end up with more cuts than harvested wheat. Studies show that a good harvester could cut about an acre of wheat in a day, but they had to make about 15,000 individual cuts to do it. Talk about repetitive motion injury. Indeed, archaeologists have found that most medieval peasants had arthritis by their mid-30s. No wonder. They were essentially doing CrossFit from the age of 6. Winter wasn't exactly downtime either. This was when peasants had to repair everything that broke during the year: tools, buildings, fences. They also had to care for the animals, which meant trudging through snow to feed them and clean their shelters. Plus, this was prime time for indoor work like spinning wool, making candles, and repairing clothes. A medieval winter was basically one long home improvement project. Mine is the helpful YouTube tutorial. What might surprise you is that medieval peasants actually had more vacation days than most of us do now. The church enforced numerous holy days when work was forbidden, and some historians estimate they had around 150 days off per year. The clever bit about medieval work was how communal it was. Everyone pitched in during busy times, and they developed a complex system of mutual aid. If your neighbor's ox died, you'd lend them yours, knowing they'd do the same for you. It was like an early version of Social Security, just with more manure and less paperwork. Recent studies of medieval village records show that these informal support networks were incredibly effective. Villages that practiced strong cooperation were more likely to survive famines and economic hardships. Let's not forget about the specialized skills many peasants developed. Some became experts at specific crafts like beekeeping, brewing, or blacksmithing. These weren't just hobbies. They were essential services that could mean the difference between having enough to trade for necessities or going without. It's estimated that a skilled medieval blacksmith could make up to 100 nails in a day, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize each one was made by hand. After all this back-breaking work, you'd think these folks would at least get to enjoy a hearty meal. Well, about that. The average medieval peasant ate around 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day, which sounds pretty good until you realize they were basically doing intense physical labor from dawn till dusk. Bread was their main food. We're talking about 2 to 3 pounds of bread every single day. But this wasn't your fancy artisanal sourdough from a boutique bakery. Medieval bread often contained bits of sand and grit from the millstones used to grind the grain. Over time, this would actually wear down their teeth, giving them a real reason to need a dentist. The most common drink was something called small beer, a weak, low-alcohol beer that everyone, including kids, drank instead of water. Why? Because the water was often contaminated, and the brewing process made the beer safer to drink. That's right. In medieval times, beer was literally safer than water. A historical fact you can use to justify your drinking habit. The medieval diet followed a strict hierarchy. The best cuts of meat went to the nobles, while peasants got what was left, usually the parts we today throw away or feed to pets. They ate lots of pottage, a thick soup made from peas, beans, and whatever vegetables they could grow. It was basically the medieval version of throw everything in a pot and hope for the best. Sometimes it was so thick you could stand a spoon up in it. Medieval peasants would eat this for days, sometimes weeks, adding new ingredients as they got them. It was like the world's longest-running leftover situation. During good times, peasants might get to eat bacon or salt pork. Fresh meat was rare, maybe a few times a year during festivals. Can you imagine saving up all year just to have one decent piece of meat? It's like waiting for Black Friday, except instead of getting a new TV, you're hoping for a piece of chicken. When they did get meat, they used absolutely everything from the snout to the tail. They even had a saying, "You use everything but the squeal." It sounds like they invented the original zero-waste movement. Medieval peasants were actually pretty clever with food preservation. They had to be. One bad harvest could mean starvation. They developed amazing techniques for smoking, salting, and fermenting food. They could keep cabbage edible through winter by turning it into sauerkraut, and they dried peas and beans until they were hard as rocks. Literally, archaeologists sometimes find them and can still identify the species. Some of these preserved foods would last for years, which makes our modern obsession with expiration dates seem a bit silly. During famines, which happened about once every generation, things got really desperate. Historical records show people eating bark, clay, and even leather shoes. The church made things even more complicated by declaring certain days as fish days when meat wasn't allowed. But since most peasants lived far from the coast, their fish might be beaver tail or barnacle geese, because apparently medieval religious authorities decided these counted as fish. I guess if you squint really hard and use your imagination, this led to some pretty creative alternative facts about animals. There were actual scholarly debates about whether barnacle geese grew on trees. Spoiler alert, they don't. Speaking of religion affecting food, the medieval calendar was full of fasting days, up to 150 per year. On these days, you could only eat one meal, and often couldn't eat any animal products. After a long day of work and eating their pottage, what did these folks call home? Trust me, it wasn't exactly house hunters' material. In medieval times, the concept of home sweet home took on a whole different meaning. Ever heard someone complain about their one-bedroom apartment being too small? Well, medieval peasants would have a good laugh at that. Their homes made modern tiny houses look like luxury mansions. The average peasant house was about 400 square feet. That's smaller than most two-car garages today. And get this, the whole family lived there, along with their chickens and other small animals. Talk about an early version of a petting zoo. The construction of these houses was interesting, to say the least. Most were built using a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle was a bunch of sticks woven together like a giant basket, and daub was a mixture of mud, straw, and animal poop that was smeared all over the wattle. When it dried, it became surprisingly strong. Recent archaeological experiments have shown that these walls could last up to 50 years if properly maintained. Not bad for mud and poop, and the best part? If a wall started to crumble, you could just slap on some more daub. It was like a medieval spackle. About 90% of peasant houses had dirt floors. They would spread fresh rushes on the floor and add herbs to make it smell better. These rushes would stay there for months, collecting bits of food, dirt, and who knows what else. When they got too gross, they would just add a new layer on top. It was like having a compost pile right in your living room. The roof was typically thatched with straw, which could be up to 2 feet thick. It was pretty good at keeping out rain, but it was also a favorite home for rats, mice, and insects. Medieval peasants basically had a whole ecosystem living above their heads. The smoke from their fire had to find its way out through the thatch, since chimneys were a luxury most couldn't afford. Windows, more like wind holes. Most peasant houses had no glass in their windows. Glass was super expensive. Instead, they used wooden shutters or oiled parchment to keep out the weather. During winter, they'd stuff the holes with straw or old clothes. Light was provided by rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat. They gave off about as much light as a birthday candle, which meant that once it got dark, you pretty much had to go to bed. The furniture was minimal. Most families had a table, maybe a couple of benches, and a chest for storing their few precious belongings. Beds were a luxury. Most people slept on straw-stuffed mattresses right on the floor, huddling together for warmth. One of the most interesting discoveries from archaeological digs is the midden, a fancy word for the medieval garbage dump. Every house had one, usually right outside the door. Scientists have found everything from broken pottery to animal bones to lost coins in these middens. It's like a medieval time capsule. The layout of peasant villages was actually pretty smart. Houses were usually built close together, creating a real sense of community. Most villages had a central green where animals could graze and kids could play. Recent studies of village layouts show they were often designed to maximize sunlight and minimize wind exposure. These folks knew a thing or two about energy efficiency. Living in these close quarters meant everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy wasn't really a medieval concept. You could probably hear your neighbor's entire argument about whose turn it was to clean the communal pig pen. But stepping outside meant dealing with a whole different world of rules and laws that could make today's most complicated Deu's agreement look simple. The feudal system wasn't just complicated. It was like a weird game of Simon Says, where Simon was your local lord, and not following his rules could cost you way more than just being out of the game. Medieval peasants were basically born into a subscription service they couldn't cancel. From the moment they took their first breath, peasants owed their local lord a chunk of everything they produced. And we're not talking about a small cut. Records show that peasants had to give up to 50% of their crops to their lord. It's like having a really demanding roommate who doesn't actually live with you but still eats half your food. Court records from the time tell some pretty wild stories. One peasant was fined for collecting excessive amounts of firewood. Apparently, staying too warm was against the rules. Another got in trouble for killing a rabbit on his own land, because all wild animals, even the fish in the streams, technically belonged to the lord. Speaking of rules, peasants couldn't just up and move whenever they wanted. They were literally tied to their land, a state called being bound to the soil. If you wanted to leave your village, you needed permission from your lord. Some medieval records show peasants having to pay a fee just to marry someone from another village. Talk about an expensive dating scene. The manor court was where all the local drama went down. These weren't fancy modern courtrooms. They were often held in the open air or in the manor house's great hall. The lord or his steward would sit in judgment over everything from property disputes to petty crimes. One court record from 1320 shows a man being fined for making excessive noise while brewing beer. But peasants actually had some legal rights. Even if they were pretty basic, they could bring cases to the manor court, and some records show they often won. Scientists studying medieval court records found that about 40% of cases brought by peasants against their social superiors were successful. Not bad for a system that was completely stacked against them. The punishment system was creative, to say the least. Minor offenses might get you a fine, but more serious ones could land you in the stocks, basically a medieval version of public shaming. Imagine being stuck in a wooden frame in the village square, while your neighbors threw rotten vegetables at you. One of the strangest aspects was the hue and cry system. If you witnessed a crime, you were legally required to start yelling about it and chase the criminal. Everyone who heard you had to join in. Court records show people actually getting fined for not participating in these medieval flash mobs of justice. But the most bizarre laws often involved animals. If an animal killed someone, it could be put on trial. Yes, you read that right. Zedraz. Varje bazaars e kids fritis mezes. 4 years old. There are actual records of pigs being tried for murder, complete with defense attorneys. One famous case from 1386 involved a pig that was dressed in human clothes for its trial. Speaking of questionable practices, it's probably a good time to talk about medieval medicine. If you hate going to the doctor now, you would have loved being sick in medieval times. Their medical knowledge was a wild mix of superstition, guesswork, and things that sound like they came from a Halloween prank gone wrong. Medieval doctors had a real thing for blood, specifically getting it out of you. Got a headache? Let's drain some blood. Stomachache? More bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it. Time to break out the leeches. They believed all illnesses came from an imbalance of bodily fluids, and bloodletting was their favorite fix. Peasants rarely got to see these qualified doctors. Instead, they relied on local healers and herbalists who actually knew their stuff when it came to plants. Recent studies have shown that about 80% of medieval herbal remedies had genuine medicinal properties. The other 20%. Of our Well, let's just say eating powdered owl brain probably didn't cure your insomnia. Some of their cures were just bizarre. Got a toothache? Try kissing a donkey. Yes, that was a real remedy. Headache? Tie a dead mole to your head. The really fun treatments involved wearing various bits of animals around your neck. Everything from a dried frog to fox teeth. Despite the strangeness, archaeologists studying medieval bones found that some peasants actually survived brain surgery. They've discovered skulls with perfectly round holes that had healed over, showing the patient lived for years afterward. They called this procedure trepanning, and the success rate was around 80%. Which is pretty impressive considering they were basically drilling holes in people's heads with hand tools. When the Black Death hit in 1348, things got really interesting. Doctors came up with bizarre protective gear, including crazy beak-shaped masks filled with herbs that looked like scary bird costumes. But it wasn't all bad. They did have some smart ideas. Honey was used as an antiseptic on wounds, and it actually worked. Modern science has proven honey has natural antibacterial properties. They also used moldy bread on infections, accidentally discovering penicillin about 800 years before Alexander Fleming. Some healers even figured out how to set broken bones pretty well. Despite all this, medieval peasants weren't much shorter lived than people in ancient Rome. If you made it past childhood, you had a decent chance of reaching 60 or 70. Maybe there's something to be said for kissing donkeys after all. Between all the hard work and crazy medical treatments, these folks definitely knew how to let loose. The medieval calendar had about 50 holidays per year. That's way more than we get now. Sure, most of them were religious festivals, but medieval people turned pretty much any excuse into a party. Take May Day, for example. This wasn't just your average spring celebration. It was like a modern music festival, a carnival, and a village-wide dating app, all rolled into one. Young people would go a-maying in the woods, which basically meant sneaking off to flirt while others danced around the maypole. The church wasn't too happy about these celebrations, with countless records of priests complaining about ungodly behavior. Medieval sports were intense. Football wasn't played on a neat field with rules. It was played through the entire village with hundreds of players and pretty much no rules except get the ball to your end of town. Records show entire villages getting banned from playing because too many windows got broken. Music was everywhere in medieval life. You didn't need fancy instruments. People made music with whatever they had. Spoons, pots, even bones. Professional musicians called minstrels would travel from village to village, sharing news and songs like medieval radio stations on legs. Drinking games. Oh yeah, they had those too. One popular game involved everyone drinking from a communal bowl without spilling. If you spilled, you had to drink more as a punishment. Taverns were such an important part of village life that some manors actually required them to stay open. The biggest parties were usually wedding celebrations, which could last for days with the whole community contributing food and drink. They also invented many of the games we still play today, like chess, backgammon, and even card games, though their versions were way cooler, with kings riding unicorns and queens fighting dragons. Not all entertainment was wild parties. Storytelling was huge in medieval culture. After dinner, especially in winter, families would gather to share tales. Some were educational, some were funny, and some were definitely not suitable for children. Many of our classic fairy tales come from these medieval storytelling sessions. These rare bright spots of fun and community were essential for surviving an otherwise challenging existence, providing a much-needed release from the daily grind and a way to build the strong social bonds that held their world together. You might think medieval romance relied on love at first sight across market squares, but courtship was way more complicated than that. Forget Tinder and dating apps. Medieval peasants had their own ways of finding love, and some of them were pretty wild. The average age for marriage was around 20 to 22 for women, and 24 to 26 for men, which is actually not too different from today. Dating wasn't exactly casual. Young people usually met at church festivals, village dances, or while working in the fields. Court records tell us about one creative young man who kept accidentally letting a sheep wander into a certain girl's field, just to have an excuse to talk to her. Marriage was serious business, and parents were usually involved in arranging matches. They weren't just thinking about love. They were thinking about land, skills, and whether their future in-laws had a good plow horse. Medieval couples didn't need a priest or even witnesses to get married. They just had to exchange promises. I take you as my wife, and I take you as my husband. And boom, they were married. This, of course, led to some pretty interesting court cases, with people claiming they got married while drunk or that they thought a promise was just a joke. The wedding celebration itself was a huge deal, a party that could last for days with the bride wearing her best dress, usually in a bright color like blue or green. Family life was different too. Newly married couples often lived with their parents until they could afford their own place, leading to some hilarious recorded arguments between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. Children were expected to help with work from an early age, but it wasn't all chores. Archaeologists have found lots of medieval toys, from little clay horses to wooden swords. The roles of men and women were pretty fixed, but there were surprises. Women could own businesses, and records show female brewers, bakers, and even blacksmiths. While divorce didn't exist, couples could get an annulment for some amazing excuses, like a wife being too fond of cheese. Finally, the church ruled medieval peasant life with an iron fist and a hungry collection plate. For peasants, religion wasn't just something you did on Sundays. It controlled pretty much every moment of their lives. They had to give the church a tithe, which meant 1/10 of everything they produced. 10 eggs, 1 goes to the church. 10 bags of grain, the church gets 1. For peasants who barely had enough to eat, this was a huge burden. On top of that, they had to pay extra for any church service they needed. from baptisms to funerals. The church calendar even controlled when they could work, with numerous holy days where labor was forbidden, even if rain threatened to ruin the crops. To cope, peasants developed a clever mix of Christianity and old folk beliefs. A peasant might go to church in the morning, then secretly visit the local wise woman for a blessing on their crops in the afternoon. Archaeological digs in peasant homes have found Christian crosses buried next to good luck charms made from herbs and bones. They were covering all their spiritual bases. The local priest had huge power over their daily lives, and the fear of hell was a powerful tool used to keep peasants in line. They were breized in knees, our brise, our season day. Church paintings showed vivid tortures for sins like skipping mass or stealing food, but medieval peasants found clever ways to deal with all these religious demands. They'd make deals with saints, share the cost of services between families, and even rotate church attendance to share the time burden. Looking at all these records, court cases and archaeological findings shows us just how creative and resilient they were. Their relationship with the church perfectly sums up what it meant to be a medieval peasant. Life was incredibly hard, but they always found ways to make it work. Perhaps in that way, they weren't so different from people today, just trying to navigate life's rules while keeping food on the table and hope in their hearts.